The story of the Habsburg dynasty is, in many ways, a study in how marriage rules that might strike you as absurd, suffocating, or even grotesque, could build empires and also destroy them. If you picture the mighty Habsburgs, you might recall vast empires stretching from the New World to the heart of Europe, armies marching under their banners, and courts glittering with gold. Yet, beneath that surface grandeur lay fragile foundations, built upon centuries of carefully arranged marriages. The Habsburgs were notorious for their obsession with keeping the bloodline pure. This phrase, which carries a sinister edge today, was once considered not only normal but essential. Marriage in royal houses was rarely about love. It was about survival, politics, and control. To maintain their grip on power, the Habsburgs turned inward, choosing spouses from within their own family. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, and sometimes bloodlines twisted back on themselves so tightly that entire generations seemed to collapse under the weight. When you think of the Habsburg dynasty, you likely imagine Charles II of Spain, often remembered as the Bewitched. His tragic figure, deformed, sickly, and mentally unstable, has become an almost grotesque symbol of dynastic inbreeding. His famous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower lip so severe that he struggled to chew food, was a visible legacy of centuries of close relative marriages. But Charles II was not simply an accident of biology. He was the inevitable outcome of a system that prioritized political convenience over human health. The roots of this obsession stretch back to the very origins of the family's power. In the late Middle Ages, when dynastic marriages were tools of statecraft, rulers sought alliances to protect their territories. The Habsburgs rose from a relatively modest position in the Swiss Alps to become one of the most powerful houses in Europe, not by winning every war, but by marrying wisely. The family motto, often paraphrased as "let others wage wars, you, fortunate Austria, marry," was more than a clever saying. It was a blueprint for empire. Every union was strategic. Consider Maximilian I, who married Mary of Burgundy in 1477. This marriage handed the Habsburgs vast territories in the Low Countries, expanding their power dramatically. His descendants followed this pattern obsessively, marrying into Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, and beyond. These marriages did not only link houses, they redrew the map of Europe without firing a cannon. But the system had a flaw. There were only so many suitable noble partners, and the tighter the circle, the greater the risk of bloodlines looping back. Over time, the Habsburgs began to look less outward and more inward. Intermarriage became not just occasional but routine. The genetic consequences grew severe. By the 16th and 17th centuries, nearly every branch of the family tree was tangled with another, until the tree itself looked less like a spreading oak and more like a tightly coiled vine. What was life like for these children of political contracts? Imagine being born into a palace, your every move watched, your future already planned. Your nursemaid whispered to you not of fairy tales, but of treaties, alliances, and contracts. You might be promised in marriage before you could walk. And the partner? Likely someone you already knew well. A cousin, perhaps even an uncle. Marriage was not a matter of affection, but of necessity. The details, how much dowry, which territories, what claims, were negotiated by advisors long before you entered the room. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, the Habsburg jaw had become so pronounced in the family line that it was practically expected. His birth was celebrated, for he was a long-awaited heir, but whispers began early. He was frail, he struggled to speak, and he was frequently ill. As he grew, courtiers noticed not just his deformities, but his inability to produce an heir. This was more than a family tragedy. It was a political catastrophe. The dynasty that had stretched across centuries and continents suddenly found itself staring at extinction. You might wonder, why did no one stop this? Couldn't the Habsburgs see the danger in marrying so closely? The answer lies partly in their worldview. To them, the risk of genetic weakness seemed distant and abstract compared to the very real threat of losing territory. To marry outside risked diluting claims or strengthening a rival house. To marry inside guaranteed continuity, even if that continuity came at a terrible cost. And so, generation after generation, the pattern continued. The Habsburg chin grew more pronounced, fertility declined, and illnesses compounded. By the end of the 17th century, the dynasty that had once ruled much of the known world was fragile, dependent on the survival of a single sickly king. But Charles II's story is not simply one of personal tragedy. His reign represented a turning point in European history. The death of the last Spanish Habsburg without an heir would ignite the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped the balance of power in Europe for generations. His body, weak and broken, carried the weight of centuries of political choices. Yet before we reach the war, before we examine the treaties and battles, we must pause here, in the chambers of the Alcazar Madrid, where a young and struggling king tried to fulfill the expectations of his ancestors. He was the product of centuries of marriages that bent human lives to political ends. His very existence was a reminder of the cost of dynastic ambition. And here, you might ask yourself, if the Habsburgs had chosen love over strategy, would the course of European history have been entirely different? When we left Charles II of Spain in the Alcazar Madrid, we saw him as the fragile heir of a system stretched beyond its natural limits. To understand his reign, and why it represented not only the end of the dynasty, but also the beginning of a new European order, we must step deeper into mechanics of Habsburg marriage, court life, and the peculiar rituals that bound these rulers together. For the Habsburgs, marriage was never simply about a union of two individuals. It was an administrative process, overseen by lawyers, diplomats, clerics, and courtiers. Every detail mattered. A bride's dowry was not just a chest of jewels or coin. It might include entire provinces, castles, or rights to lucrative trade routes. A groom's obligations were equally binding, often promising military aid, alliances, and access to the wider Habsburg network. To the outside world, these marriages were glittering spectacles. Imagine processions through Vienna or Madrid, lined with courtiers in elaborate silks, musicians playing, incense burning, and the bride and groom exchanging vows in cathedrals echoing with chants. But behind the splendor, every word of the contract had been debated endlessly in secret chambers. The spectacle was for the people. The paperwork was for the survival of empires. In Charles II's case, the urgency of marriage was even greater. Spain was weakened by decades of economic strain, declining trade, and costly wars. A healthy heir was desperately needed to stabilize the dynasty. Yet, the irony was bitter. The very tradition that had brought the Habsburgs to power, generations of cousin marriage, had left Charles unable to produce children. Charles's reign became dominated by his health, or rather, his lack of it. Reports from ambassadors paint a picture of a man in constant suffering. He could barely chew food due to his jaw deformity, his body was frail, and his mind was often clouded. Physicians swarmed around him, prescribing remedies that ranged from the mundane, bleeding, purging, to the bizarre potions, incantations, holy relics. Superstition clung to him like a shadow. In Spain, a deeply Catholic country, many whispered that Charles was cursed. Some believed he was bewitched, hence his infamous nickname. Exorcisms were attempted in court. Priests prayed at his bedside, and relics were pressed against his body in desperate hopes of curing him. Every failure added to the sense of doom. And yet, despite his frailty, Charles was still a king. He presided over councils, approved decrees, and listened to petitions. Courtiers adapted their expectations, learning to interpret his silences, his pauses, and his occasional bursts of clarity. He was not simply a puppet, though he was often treated as one. Ministers, foreign ambassadors, and powerful court factions fought over influence, using the king's weakness as an opportunity to advance their own agendas. Charles married twice. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans, a niece of Louis XIV of France. The marriage was a political move designed to reduce tensions between France and Spain, but it was also a gamble. Could this bride, young and vibrant, produce an heir where Charles's body seemed to fail him? The answer was tragically clear. Despite years of marriage, Marie-Louise bore no children. At court, rumors flew wildly. Was the queen infertile? Was the king incapable? Physicians inspected both, subjecting them to humiliating examinations. Superstition once again crept in, with talk of curses, poisons, or divine punishment. Marie-Louise, a French princess transplanted into the suffocating Spanish court, sank into despair. She died young in 1689, her body worn down by illness and grief. Charles's second marriage was to Maria Anne of Newburgh, chosen partly for a famously fertile family. Her mother had given birth to an astonishing 23 children. If fertility could be inherited, surely Maria Anna would succeed where Marie Louise had failed. Yet, the pattern repeated itself. No heir came, and whispers grew louder. The dynasty teetered on the edge of extinction. The failure of Charles II to produce an heir was not just a family tragedy. It was a European crisis. The Spanish Empire was still vast, with holdings in the Americas, the Netherlands, Italy, and beyond. Who would inherit this wealth and power? Every court in Europe had a candidate in mind. The French, under Louis XIV, saw an opportunity for Bourbon expansion. The Austrian Habsburgs, related to Charles through centuries of entangled marriages, claimed the right of succession. Other powers, like England and the Dutch Republic, feared that if either side gained too much, the delicate balance of Europe would collapse. Thus, even before Charles's death, his body became a diplomatic battlefield. Foreign ambassadors scrutinized his health reports, desperate for signs of recovery or imminent death. Treaties were drafted, secret negotiations undertaken, and coalitions prepared for war, all orbiting around a man who could barely stand without assistance. Meanwhile, Spain itself groaned under the weight of mismanagement. The court, absorbed in questions of succession, neglected pressing issues of economy and governance. The silver fleets from the New World brought wealth, but corruption and inefficiency drained it away. Famine, plague, and unrest spread among ordinary people, who cared little about dynastic politics, but felt deeply the burden of royal failure. As the 17th century drew to a close, Charles's health deteriorated further. Every attempt at remedy failed. By the 1690s, his survival was itself a miracle. Foreign observers began to describe him as already half dead, his reign carried forward by the sheer inertia of monarchy. And yet, in this fragile man lay the future of Europe. Every day he lived delayed the inevitable conflict. Every day he failed to produce an heir made that conflict more certain. His body, frail and deformed, carried centuries of dynastic ambition and the fate of empires. The Habsburgs had once believed that strategic marriage would guarantee eternal dominance. But in Charles II, we see the flaw of that belief. That power secured through blood alone can collapse under its own weight. His reign forces us to ask a question that lingers even now. What happens when the very strategies that build empires also ensure their destruction? By the late 1690s, Europe lived in anxious anticipation. The health of Charles II of Spain was not merely a private matter. It was a global concern. Every ambassador, every court, every council chamber across the continent revolved around the fate of a single man whose body had been shaped by centuries of dynastic marriages. The question was not if Charles would die without an heir, it was when and what would follow. Charles lingered longer than many expected. Sickly from birth, frail throughout his reign, he managed to survive into his late 30s. By the time of his final decline, his body was so ravaged that contemporaries describe him as barely human. One court physician, after examining him, remarked that his corpse seemed to have been kept alive by divine intervention rather than natural strength. In 1700, Charles II finally died at the age of 38. His passing was mourned in Spain, but across Europe it was less grief than calculation. He left no heir. Centuries of careful marriages, treaties, and alliances had come to nothing. The Spanish Habsburg line, once among the most powerful dynasties in the world, ended with him. But Charles's death did not mean peace. In fact, it unleashed chaos. His will name Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV of France, as a successor. For France, this was a triumph. A Bourbon king on the Spanish throne could mean the union of two of Europe's most powerful crowns. For everyone else, it was a nightmare. Almost immediately, Europe was plunged into one of its largest wars of the early modern period, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. This was not a conflict about ideology or religion, as so many earlier wars had been. It was a war about balance of power, about preventing France from becoming so dominant that no other state could rival it. On one side stood France and Spain, under Philip V, the Bourbon claimant. On the other were a coalition of England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and several German states, who backed the Austrian Habsburg claim instead. The war raged across Europe, from the field of Flanders to the plains of Italy, and even spread to colonial territories where rival empires fought for supremacy. Battles like Blenheim 1704, Ramillies 1706, and Malplaquet 1709 became legendary, not only for their scale but for the way they revealed the exhaustion of an entire continent. Tens of thousands died, cities were devastated, and economies strained under the weight of the conflict. All of this because one sickly king had died without children. While the war raged, Spain itself underwent transformation. The old Habsburg system, with its tangled webs of privilege and declining power, gave way to Bourbon reforms. Philip V, though a foreigner, introduced new structures of governance. Centralization replaced a fractured patchwork of local laws. Military and economic reforms slowly pulled Spain back toward relevance. Ironically, the death of the Habsburg line, though tragic in one sense, gave Spain the chance to shed centuries of stagnation. But it was not without cost. Regions like Catalonia resisted fiercely, preferring the old autonomy they had enjoyed under the Habsburgs. The war thus became not only an international conflict, but also a civil struggle within Spain itself. The Bourbon victory meant that Spain would move forward as a more unified state, but at the price of bitter regional resentment that lingers even into modern times. For the wider Habsburg dynasty, the extinction of their Spanish branch was both a loss and a turning point. The Austrian Habsburgs remained powerful, ruling over Central Europe, but they had failed to keep Spain within their family. The great dream of a universal Habsburg monarchy, stretching from Madrid to Vienna, across Europe and into the Americas, was gone forever. Charles II's death symbolized not only the failure of dynastic marriage strategies, but also the limits of blood as a foundation for empire. The Habsburgs had built their house on marriages, on contracts, treaties, and calculated unions. For centuries, this had seemed to work. They had acquired Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, Hungary, and more through careful matchmaking. Their motto, "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry," had been proven true again and again. And yet, by turning inward, by tightening the circle until it strangled itself, they had doomed their Spanish line. Charles II was not an accident of nature. He was an inevitable result of policy. His jaw, his illnesses, his infertility, they were all political choices made flesh. When you listen to this story, you might be tempted to think of it as grotesque or tragic, a tale of deformity and decline. But beneath the surface lies a quieter truth, one that may be more significant. The Habsburg marriage policies remind us that history is often shaped not only by battles or revolutions, but by mundane, bureaucratic choices. Who signs a contract? Who marries whom? Who inherits what? The Habsburgs believed they were securing their future by narrowing their marriages. Instead, they sealed their fate. It was not glorious battles that destroyed them, nor uprisings nor assassinations. It was paperwork, bloodlines, and the slow erosion of health over generations. Boring details, marriage rules, dowries, genealogical charts, brought down an empire. As you think of Charles II, pale and sickly in the palace halls of Madrid, you might reflect on how ordinary human needs, love, health, companionship, were sacrificed for power. Did the Habsburgs ever wonder, as they signed yet another contract, what it might mean for the children born of these unions? Or did they simply assume that blood and politics were enough to secure eternity? The story of the Habsburg chin leaves us with an unsettling question. When we design systems that prize efficiency, control, or ambition above all else, are we unknowingly creating weaknesses that will one day bring a whole structure down? And so the dynasty fell, not with a bang on the battlefield, but with a whisper in the bedchamber, when a frail king closed his eyes for the last time. When you think of Versailles, perhaps you picture dazzling chandeliers, endless gilded corridors, and manicured gardens stretching into the horizon. But behind all that splendor, behind the mirrors and the gold, there was another kind of machinery at work, one that was less visible but far more consequential. At Versailles, marriage was a contract, a chess move, a calculation, and while the palace may have glittered with beauty, the private lives of its inhabitants were tightly bound by rules that most of us today would find suffocating. Louis XIV, the Sun King, reigned from 1643 until 1715. making him one of the longest ruling monarchs in history. His court was a theater of power, and marriage was one of its most important performances. To the untrained eye, a royal wedding at Versailles might seem like a celebration of love. Gowns of silk, orchestras, fountains illuminated by candlelight. Yet behind the spectacle, every marriage contract was carefully designed to maintain control, secure alliances, and reinforce the king's absolute authority. Louis XIV himself set the tone. His marriage to Maria Theresa of Spain in 1660 was not a love match, but a peace treaty. For decades, France and Spain had been locked in a bitter rivalry, fighting wars that drained treasuries and lives. The Treaty of the Pyrenees, signed in 1659, ended one of these conflicts and sealed the peace with a marriage. Maria Theresa brought with her a dowry that was never fully paid and renounced her claims to the Spanish throne, a renunciation that would later prove controversial. Louis was polite, even affectionate toward Maria Theresa, but their relationship was marked by distance. He quickly took mistresses, and his passion was directed elsewhere. Yet the marriage had served its purpose. It reinforced peace with Spain and secured the Bourbon position in Europe. The Queen's role was not to be loved, but to provide heirs, and she did, though only one son survived to adulthood. This was the template. At Versailles, love was secondary, almost irrelevant. Contracts came first. Versailles became, in effect, a vast marriage market. Courtiers schemed tirelessly to secure advantageous matches for their children. Daughters were groomed not for romance, but for negotiation. Their education emphasized accomplishments that would make them pleasing wives, needlework, music, polite conversation. But behind these polite accomplishments lay ruthless strategy. For example, the Montmorency family might seek to bind themselves to the Condés, while the Orleans branch of the royal family might plot marriages that strengthened their claims. Each marriage was a miniature treaty, and the king had the final say. Louis XIV controlled who could marry whom at court, and he used that power to prevent dangerous alliances that might threaten his supremacy. In some cases, he simply forbade unions that displeased him. When his brother, Philippe d'Orléans, fell in love with a courtier, Louis denied the match and married him instead to Henrietta of England, sister of Charles II. It was a brilliant diplomatic move, but personally disastrous. Philippe was openly homosexual, and the marriage was an unhappy one. Henrietta, charming and admired, was miserable until her early death. Yet in the world of Versailles, her feelings were irrelevant. The contract had been fulfilled. The marriage contracts of Versailles often contained clauses that seemed strange to modern eyes. Dowries were carefully calculated, not just in money but in lands, titles, and rights. In some cases, a bride's family might see control of entire estates. In others, clauses specified the inheritance rights of children not yet born. Sometimes, the clauses were more personal. For example, a bride might be required to renounce any future claim to another throne, even if she was the closest relative alive. This renunciation was binding not only on her, but on her descendants. In other words, the contract could determine the fate of dynasties for generations. One of the most famous disputes of this kind involved Louis XIV's own children. Though they were born to mistresses, Louis eventually legitimized several of them. He then sought to arrange marriages for them into powerful noble families. This enraged some traditional aristocrats, who viewed such unions as an insult. To them, marriage contracts were not only about power but about purity of blood. And once again, the paperwork carried consequences far beyond the individuals involved. It would be tempting to imagine that everyone at Versailles obeyed these rules without complaint. But of course, people are people. Courtiers fell in love. Young nobles dreamed of marrying for affection. Some even attempted secret unions. These were called mariages clandestines, and though romantic in spirit, they were politically dangerous. If discovered, such unions could be annulled, and the offenders might face exile from court. One striking example was Louis XIV's niece, the Duchess of Montpensier, who fell in love with Antoine Nampart de Caumont, a soldier. Their romance scandalized court, for it was unthinkable that a woman of royal blood might marry a man without sufficient standing. Their union was prevented, and Montpensier lived out her life embittered and alone. The message was clear. At Versailles, your heart did not belong to you. It belonged to the king, to your family, to the state. The very ceremonies of marriage at Versailles were designed to reinforce this. Weddings were public affairs, witnessed by crowds of courtiers. Every gesture, every vow, every blessing was a reminder that this was not a private act, but a public duty. The king himself often presided, lending his aura of authority to the union. The bride and groom might exchange vows, but the real power lay in the contracts signed before the ceremony. These documents, thick with legal language, listed obligations, renunciations, and promises. They were read aloud, witnessed, and stored in archives where they could be consulted for decades. The performance of marriage, in other words, was theater. The reality was ink on parchment. For the individuals caught in this system, the cost was high. Many queens, princesses, and noble women found themselves in loveless marriages. Their primary duty was to produce heirs, and if they failed, they were blamed, sometimes cruelly. Men, too, bore the burden of unions they did not choose. For some, this meant enduring a lifetime with a partner they did not love. For others, it meant turning to mistresses or lovers in secret, while fulfilling the public role of husband. And yet, the system endured, because it worked, at least in terms of politics. France under Louis XIV remained powerful, stable, and dominant. Versailles, with all its rules, contract, and controls, became the model of absolutist monarchy. But beneath the gold and mirrors, beneath the carefully orchestrated spectacles, lay a question that could never be asked aloud. What happens when love itself becomes forbidden, when marriage is reduced to ink, signatures, and renunciations? In the previous section, we saw how marriage at Versailles was less a private union than a carefully arranged contract, a tool of politics and control. But rules, no matter how strict, are always tested. Behind the gleaming facades of Versailles, love, desire, and scandal persisted. Human beings, after all, are not contracts. They are impulsive, emotional, and often willing to defy authority, sometimes at great cost. Versailles was, paradoxically, both the most rigid and the most scandalous of courts. The rigid side was public: contracts, ceremonies, rules. The scandalous side was private: affairs, rumors, secret liaisons. And yet, the two worlds often collided, producing outcomes that shook the entire system. One of the most notorious cases involved Louis XIV's own brother, Philippe d'Orléans. His marriage to Henrietta of England had been orchestrated by the king himself, intended to strengthen ties with the English monarchy. But Philippe was openly devoted to his male favorites, particularly the Chevalier de Lorraine. Henrietta, though admired by many at court for her wit and beauty, found herself in a loveless and humiliating marriage. She died young, possibly from natural illness, though some whispered of poison. Her death became a scandal, fueling suspicions about the dangers of forced unions. Yet Philippe's situation was not unique. Many nobles of Versailles lived double lives, outwardly fulfilling their contractual duties, inwardly pursuing affairs. The palace, with its endless corridors and hidden apartments, became a maze of intrigue. Love letters were smuggled through servants. Rendezvous were arranged under the cover of festivals. The sheer number of courtiers, thousands at its peak, meant that anonymity was possible, even in the most watched place in Europe. Among the greatest challenges to the system were clandestine marriages. Unions performed in secret, without the king's permission. These were dangerous acts of defiance, for Louis XIV viewed unauthorized marriages as direct threats to his authority. One famous example was the secret marriage of François de Bourbon, Prince de Conti, to a noble woman of lower rank. The marriage had been motivated by genuine affection, but when discovered, it caused uproar. Louis refused to recognize the union and punished those involved. The lesson was clear. In Versailles, your personal happiness could never outweigh the state's interests. But clandestine marriages also happened within the royal family itself. Some historians believe that Louis XIV secretly married Madame de Maintenon, his mistress, after the death of Queen Maria Theresa. The evidence is circumstantial. There is no surviving marriage certificate, but many contemporaries were convinced. If true, it was a striking reversal of the Versailles system. The king himself, the architect of strict marriage rules, had broken them for love. Yet even this supposed union was kept hidden, a private consolation rather than a public act. Mistresses provided another outlet for those trapped in contracts. At Versailles, they were not only tolerated but often celebrated. Louis XIV himself had many, most famously Madame de Montespan, whose wit, charm, and influence made her almost queen in all but name for a time. For noblemen, too, mistresses became a way of balancing contract and desire. Their official marriages might bind them to alliances, but their mistresses gave them affection, intimacy, or passion. For women, the situation was more constrained, but some noble women nonetheless pursued discreet affairs, often at great risk. Discovery can mean exile from court, the loss of reputation, or even imprisonment in convents. Mistresses, then, became both an open secret and a political tool. They softened the harshness of contractual marriages, but they also complicated the system, creating rivalries, jealousies, and shifting alliances within the court. Some forbidden loves were so powerful that they became legendary. Consider the case of Louis XIV's cousin, La Grande Mademoiselle, and Marie-Louise d'Orleans. Immensely wealthy and independent, she fell in love with Antoine Nampart de Caumont, Duke of Lauzun. Their affection was genuine, their intentions serious, and for a brief moment it seemed the king might permit their marriage. But the union was politically dangerous. Lauzun was a man of ambition, but not of sufficiently high rank to marry one of the richest heiresses in Europe. At the last moment, Louis XIV revoked his permission. The engagement was canceled, and both lovers were devastated. Lauzun was even imprisoned in the Bastille for years. And Marie never married, living out her days in bitterness. Their story became a symbol of how absolute monarchy could crush personal happiness beneath the weight of politics. Another case involved Henriette N., the English princess married to Philippe d'Orleans. While enduring her husband's indifference, she developed a close relationship with Louis XIV himself. Whether their bond was platonic or romantic remains debated, but their intimacy caused rumors that scandalized Europe. When Henriette died suddenly, suspicions of poison only added to the aura of forbidden love. Beyond the personal stories, it is important to remember that marriage contracts themselves were weapons in the arsenal of power. They could be used to reward loyalty, to punish defiance, to bind allies more tightly, or to weaken rivals. A noble family that fell out of favor might find its children denied good matches. A favored courtier, on the other hand, might suddenly find themselves married into wealth and status. This use of marriage as reward and punishment reinforced Louis XIV's control. He alone held the key to advancement. The great families of France, who might once have challenged the crown, were now reduced to jockeying for the king's approval in matters as personal as their children's futures. Versailles became a golden cage, and marriage was one of its bars. As you imagine these lives, ask yourself, what would it be like to have no choice in love, to know that your marriage was decided not by your heart, but by signatures on a document? For many at Versailles, this was reality. Young nobles grew up knowing their destinies were already written, their partners chosen for them before they had even come of age. Some adapted, finding happiness in duty, companionship in arranged unions, or solace in religion. Others rebelled quietly, turning to affairs, friendships, or secret marriages. Still others sank into despair, their personal lives a quiet tragedy hidden beneath the splendor of court. The system worked politically, but for individuals, it could be suffocating. Versailles shone with golden light, its gardens endless, its mirrors reflecting the power of a king who called himself the sun. But beneath that light, shadows stretched long. Every contract, every union, every forbidden love whispered the same question: what is the cost of building a society where personal freedom is sacrificed for political control? And more haunting still, when rules are so strict, do they not invite defiance, scandal, and collapse from within? The gilded corridors of Versailles dazzled the eyes, but the marriage system that underpinned its society revealed a deeper truth. The palace was not simply a residence. It was a machine for control. In this final part of our story, we will explore how the rigid rules of marriage at Versailles helped secure Louis XIV's power, how they shaped the lives of those around him, and how, in the long run, they contributed to the very weaknesses that would destabilize France. Louis XIV had transformed Versailles into the symbolic center of his reign, and marriage was one of the levers he used to keep the nobility under his thumb. Noble families once enjoyed enormous independence. They could plot, feud, and ally with one another in ways that challenged a monarchy. By centralizing marriage contracts under his authority, Louis stripped them of that autonomy. A family that sought a marriage alliance needed royal approval. If Louis granted it, they were rewarded with wealth or influence. If he denied it, they risked decline. Marriage thus became a tether binding the nobility to the Sun King. It was brilliant politics, but it created generations of courtiers who lived not for themselves but for the king's nod of approval. This had a stifling effect. The noble class, once vigorous and independent, became a court society, elegant, polished, and utterly dependent on royal favor. Their power withered even as their appearances grew more splendid. Versailles glittered, but its aristocracy had been domesticated. Yet rules cannot completely extinguish human desire. The forbidden loves and clandestine unions of Versailles left their own legacies. Some became scandals that undermined the aura of control Louis sought to maintain. Others simmered quietly, shaping discontent that would only surface later. Take the case of Marie-Louise d'Orléans, La Grande Mademoiselle, whose canceled engagement to Lauzun remained one of the great romantic tragedies of the age. Her bitterness was not merely personal. It was a symbol of how even the wealthiest and most independent women could be shackled by the state. Stories like hers spread, whispered in salons, and remembered by later generations as examples of royal tyranny. Even Louis XIV's supposed secret marriage to Madame de Maintenon carried symbolic weight. If true, it revealed the paradox of the king himself. The man who controlled every marriage at court may have broken his own rules in secret. It was a sign that even the most absolute monarch could not escape the pull of private affection. Queens at Versailles lived within the harshest confines of all. Their marriages were almost always diplomatic, their lives scrutinized for fertility and virtue. Maria Theresa of Spain, Louis XIV's official queen, bore the weight of dynastic duty. She produced children, tolerated her husband's mistresses, and died quietly, remembered more for her role as a political pawn than for her personal identity. Later queens and princesses would face similar fates. They were surrounded by luxury, yet stripped of agency. Their bodies were treated as vessels for heirs, their signatures as tools for treaties. Behind their jewel crowns lay lives of quiet sacrifice. This image, queens silenced and constrained, nobles shackled by contracts, lovers separated by royal decree, contributed to the growing sense that the monarchy was both oppressive and out of touch. The people of France, many of whom lived in poverty, looked upon Versailles and saw not only wealth but a system built on the denial of human freedom. Louis XIV's system of control worked brilliantly in his lifetime. He reigned for over 70 years, maintaining stability and magnificence. But seeds planted in the soil of Versailles would bloom long after his death. By the 18th century, the rigidity of royal marriage had created a brittle society. Noble families, bound by contracts and dependent on royal favor, had lost their independence but not their pride. They chafed under restrictions while resenting their diminished political power. The monarchy seemed powerful, but in truth it rested on fragile foundations. When Louis XVI married Marie Antoinette in 1770, the echoes of Versailles' marriage system were still present. Their union was another political alliance, this time between France and Austria. But the people of France, by then weary of seeing personal lives sacrificed for dynastic gains, greeted the young queen with suspicion. Her foreign birth, her frivolity, her very presence at Versailles became symbols of a monarchy divorced from reality. The revolution of 1789 was not caused by marriage contract alone, but the culture control of Versailles, the denial of individual freedom, the prioritization of politics over humanity, fed into the resentment that exploded in that era. Looking back, Versailles teaches us that systems of control, no matter how splendid, cannot suppress human nature forever. Love, choice, and personal freedom will always find ways to assert themselves, whether in clandestine marriages, whispered scandals, or outright rebellion. The Sun King believed he could control even the most intimate parts of his subjects' lives. For a time, he succeeded, but the cost was a society that glittered on the surface while rotting beneath. As you wander in your imagination through the mirror halls of Versailles, Picture the courtiers bowing, the contracts signed, the queens and their jewels, and the nobles plotting their children's futures. Now ask yourself, what happens to society when its people are denied even the simplest freedoms, to love, to choose, to live as they wish? Versailles has long since become a museum, its golden rooms silent. But the questions raised by its marriage rules still whisper in those halls. They remind us that even in the grandest palaces, the most ordinary human needs can become the seeds of history's greatest upheavals. And so, the story of Versailles leaves us with this haunting thought. Perhaps the most dangerous thing a ruler can do is to forget that behind every contract, every treaty, and every crown, there beats a human heart. In the early 17th century, Europe was a chessboard of shifting alliances, and royal marriages were among the most powerful moves. Few proposals carried as much weight, or as much controversy, as the attempt to unite the crowns of England and Spain to what became known as the Spanish Match. To us today, it might seem almost comical, an English prince sneaking into Madrid disguised as an ordinary traveler in order to woo a princess. But in its time, the Spanish Match was deadly serious, a plan that exposed the deep fault lines of religion, politics, and national identity. The story begins with James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England in 1603, the first Stuart king to rule over both kingdoms. James was obsessed with the idea of peace in Europe. He had seen firsthand the devastation of war, and he believed diplomacy, particularly marriage diplomacy, could bring stability. His ambition was to make England a mediator between Catholic and Protestant powers, to hold a balance in a continent increasingly torn apart by religious wars. James had one living son, Charles, the future Charles I. As a young man, Charles was shy, physically frail, and overshadowed by his charismatic elder brother, Henry Frederick. But when Henry died suddenly in 1612, Charles became heir. That same year, James began to consider a grand plan, a marriage alliance with Spain, the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe. The bride in question was the Infanta Maria Anna, daughter of King Philip III of Spain. Such a union, James believed, would not only secure peace, but also provide England with a lavish dowry and prestige. But there was a catch, a very large one. Maria Anna was Catholic, and England, since the Reformation, had been fiercely Protestant. For England's ruling elite, the Spanish Match was not merely a dynastic question. It was a matter of national survival. Memories of the Spanish Armada in 1588 were still fresh. Spain had been a great enemy of Elizabeth I, and Catholicism was seen by many English Protestants as synonymous with tyranny, foreign domination, and persecution. To agree to such a marriage would mean allowing Catholic influence at the very heart of the English monarchy. Worse, Maria Anna would not marry unless Charles agreed to certain concessions for English Catholics, easing restrictions, granting toleration, perhaps even rolling back laws that barred Catholics from public office. For many in Parliament, this was unthinkable. And yet, James pressed on. He believed that compromise was possible, and he hoped that by promising religious concessions, he could secure the match. But suspicion grew. Many saw James as naive, willing to barter away the Protestant identity of his realm for Spanish gold. Into this delicate situation entered George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. Charismatic, handsome, and a favorite of James, Buckingham was a man of enormous ambition. He and Prince Charles formed a close bond, and together they hatched an extraordinary idea. In 1623, frustrated by years of stalled negotiations, Charles and Buckingham decided to travel incognito to Spain. Their plan was simple, almost absurd. If Charles presented himself in person to Maria Anna, perhaps she would be so impressed by his charm and sincerity that she would agree to the marriage. Diplomacy, they believed, could be replaced by personal gallantry. So, in February 1623, Charles and Buckingham set out, disguised as ordinary gentlemen, traveling under false names. Their journey through France and across the Pyrenees was dangerous, but they succeeded in reaching Madrid. When they revealed themselves at the Spanish court, it caused a sensation. At first, the plan seemed to have potential. Philip IV of Spain, who had succeeded his father in 1621, received Charles with courtesy, and the court buzzed with excitement at the idea of such a prestigious marriage. Charles met Maria Anna, and while he reportedly found her charming, she was horrified. Raised in strict Catholic piety, she viewed Charles, a Protestant, as unacceptable. Even so, negotiations continued. The Spanish courtiers laid out their demands. Charles must promise sweeping concessions to English Catholics, including the repeal of penal laws and full toleration of Catholic worship. These terms were far more than Charles could realistically deliver. The English public, fiercely anti-Catholic, would never accept them. Meanwhile, the Spanish were cautious. They had no real desire to see England strengthened, and some suspected that James's promises were insincere. Months passed, with endless debates over theology, dowries, and legal guarantees. Charles, increasingly frustrated, realized that personal charm could not overcome centuries of religious and political division. By the autumn of 1623, the Spanish match was effectively dead. Maria Anna refused outright to marry Charles, citing her conscience and her faith. Charles, humiliated, prepared to return to England. The entire escapade, what had begun as a romantic gamble, ended in political embarrassment. When Charles returned home, his humiliation turned to anger. He and Buckingham, once supporters of the Spanish match, now became its fiercest opponents. They urged James to abandon diplomacy with Spain and instead seek alliance with France, England's traditional rival. Ironically, the failed attempt to marry a Spanish princess only hardened anti-Spanish sentiment in England. The Spanish match was more than a failed romance. It was a turning point. It revealed the deep rifts within England over religion, the growing distrust between king and parliament, and the limits of dynastic marriage as a tool of diplomacy. For Charles himself, the episode was formative. His humiliation in Madrid taught him lessons he never forgot. Lessons about pride, about trust, and about the dangers of compromise. When he became king in 1625, these experiences shaped his stubbornness, his unwillingness to bend to Parliament, and ultimately his downfall in the English Civil War. As you imagine young Charles wandering the halls of Madrid, awkwardly attempting to woo a princess who wanted nothing to do with him, think about the absurdity and the gravity of it all. A single marriage contract, signed or unsigned, might have changed the balance of power in Europe. A young man's pride, a young woman's conscience, and the weight of centuries of religious division all converged in that one moment. And so the question lingers. If Charles and Maria Anna had been wed, could Europe have been spared decades of war, or would the Union itself have torn England apart from within? The collapse of the Spanish match was more than just a failed marriage negotiation. It was a turning point that exposed the fragility of Stuart monarchy and reshaped England's political landscape. In this section, we'll trace how the fallout from Madrid echoed across Parliament, the English public, and ultimately into the future struggles that would end in civil war. When Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham returned from Madrid in October 1623, they were greeted not with shame, but with celebration. The public, already hostile to Spain and Catholic influence, saw their failure as a deliverance. The prospect of a Catholic queen had terrified many Protestants. Now, with the match collapse, relief swept the kingdom. Pamphlets circulated, mocking the Spanish and praising Charles's decision to reject their demands. The young prince, once criticized for his timidity, now enjoyed a surge of popularity. Ironically, his humiliation abroad became his triumph at home. The failed adventure gave him an aura of patriotism, as if he had resisted Spanish manipulation rather than having been rejected. But beneath the surface, tensions deepened. The negotiations had revealed how far James I was willing to go to appease Catholic powers, and this alarmed Parliament. Members saw the king's policies as dangerously out of step with English Protestant identity. Parliament seized on the failure of the Spanish match to demand a harder line. When it convened in 1624, members urged James to declare war on Spain. They argued that England's honor had been insulted, its prince humiliated, and its religion threatened. James, ever reluctant to wage war, resisted at first. But Charles and Buckingham, now eager to prove themselves, pushed for military action. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance with Parliament against the king's cautious diplomacy. For once, the heir to the throne and the Commons stood side by side. The result was the Anglo-Spanish War, declared in 1625. Though largely unsuccessful in practice, England's campaigns against Spain were poorly organized and disastrous in execution. The war symbolized a new direction. The dream of peace through marriage diplomacy was over. England had turned decisively toward Protestant solidarity and opposition to Catholic powers. If Spain was no longer an option, France became the alternative. In 1625, shortly after becoming king, Charles married Henrietta Maria, daughter of Henry IV of France. Ironically, she too was Catholic, but the context was different. France was not England's mortal enemy in the way Spain had been, and the alliance was seen as a pragmatic move. Still, Henrietta Maria's presence in England caused tension. Many feared she would influence her husband toward Catholic sympathies. She was permitted to worship openly, surrounded by her own Catholic household, and her influence over Charles grew in time. For Parliament, this marriage revived fears of Catholic infiltration, fears that had already been stoked by the Spanish match. Thus, the very problem James had hoped to solve through diplomacy, the religious divide, remained unsolved. If anything, it had deepened. At the center of this drama stood George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. His role in the Spanish adventure had made him both famous and notorious. Some praised his loyalty to Charles. Others accused him of reckless behavior that nearly dragged the kingdom into disaster. As Charles's closest advisor, Buckingham became the de facto architect of foreign policy. He pushed for war with Spain, supported Protestant alliances on the continent, and attempted bold but often bungled military campaigns. His failures, such as a disastrous expedition to Cadiz in 1625, eroded public trust. Parliament grew increasingly hostile, blaming him for draining the treasury and mismanaging the kingdom. The resentment culminated in 1628, when Buckingham was assassinated by a disgruntled officer. His death was greeted by public celebrations, a sign of how unpopular he had become. For Charles, however, it was a devastating personal blow. The bond he had shared with Buckingham was deep, and his loss hardened Charles's distrust of Parliament, whom he blamed for fostering the atmosphere of hostility that led to the assassination. The failure in Madrid left an indelible mark on Charles's character. Humiliated by rejection, embittered by Parliament's criticisms, and traumatized by Buckingham's death, he became increasingly determined to rule without compromise. The Spanish match had revealed, in a sense, Charles's vulnerability. He had placed his pride, his hopes, and his kingdom's policy on the line, only to be thwarted. From that moment on, he grew more rigid, more unwilling to submit himself to humiliation. When he later clashed with Parliament over taxation, religion, and authority, he carried with him the memory of having once bent too far and been scorned for it. His insistence on personal rule, his marriage to a Catholic queen, his distrust of the commons. All these tendencies were sharpened by his experiences in Spain. The very qualities that would lead him into civil war had their roots in the failed marriage negotiations of his youth. The Spanish match also influenced England's place in Europe. By rejecting Spain, England positioned itself more firmly within the Protestant camp. This had consequences during the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, the great religious conflict tearing the continent apart. James had hoped to mediate between Catholic and Protestant powers, but Charles, scarred by Madrid, became a partisan of the Protestant cause. Though England's interventions in the war were often ineffective, the commitment to Protestant solidarity reshaped its diplomacy for decades. At the same time, Spain's refusal to marry its princess to a Protestant prince underscored the depth of the religious divide. Dynastic marriages could bridge many things: language barriers, cultural differences, political rivalries. But religion proved insurmountable. The Spanish match failed not because Charles lacked charm, nor because negotiations were mishandled, but because the fundamental division of Europe in the 17th century made such a union impossible. The Spanish match thus left behind a series of unanswered questions. Could England have been drawn more fully into the Catholic orbit had Charles succeeded? Would religious toleration have followed, softening the bitter divisions that plagued the kingdom? Or would such a marriage have provoked rebellion, as Parliament and the public resisted Catholic influence at the highest level of power? The answers are unknowable, but the consequences of failure were real enough. The rejection in Madrid helped set England on a path of conflict, with Spain, with Parliament, and ultimately with itself. Imagine Charles years later, sitting in Whitehall Palace, surrounded by courtiers and advisors, his Catholic queen by his side. Did he ever think back to Madrid, to the princess who refused him, to the court that mocked him, to the months wasted in futile negotiation? Did he see in those memories the seeds of the troubles that now surrounded him? For Charles, the Spanish match was never simply a youthful misadventure. It was a crucible in which his character was formed, and the shadow it cast would stretch all the way to the scaffold in 1649. And so we must ask, was the Spanish match truly a missed opportunity, or was it a necessary failure, one that revealed the fragility of dynastic politics and the dangers of forcing unions across irreconcilable divides? By now, we have followed the story of the Spanish match from its daring beginning in Madrid to its bitter collapse. Yet its legacy cannot be measured only in the rejection of Prince Charles. The failure of this dynastic gamble reverberated across decades, shaping Charles's reign, fueling mistrust between crown and parliament, and planting seeds that would later bloom into civil war. To understand its significance, we must trace how a broken marriage negotiation helped unravel a kingdom. When Charles ascended the throne in 1625, he was still living in the shadow of the Madrid humiliation. The episode had taught him a hard lesson. Diplomacy, parliament, and compromise could all lead to failure. He had presented himself openly, even recklessly, in pursuit of a Spanish bride, and been scorned. That rejection marked him. From then on, Charles became increasingly wary of allowing himself to appear weak or dependent. His reign would be characterized by an almost stubborn insistence on royal prerogative. He believed, more than his father James ever had, in the divine right of kings. Parliament was not a partner, but a nuisance. Concessions were not tools of governance, but signs of weakness. The Spanish match did not create this temperament, but it hardened it. Charles carried forward a sense of personal pride that made compromise nearly impossible. For Parliament, the Madrid affair confirmed what many had long feared. The Stuarts could not be trusted to safeguard Protestant England. James's willingness to negotiate Catholic concessions had already alarmed them. Charles's willingness to travel in disguise to Spain and plead for a Catholic bride seemed not only humiliating, but treacherous. Though Parliament initially rejoiced at the collapse of the match, the underlying suspicion never faded. When Charles later married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, though not Spanish, Parliament's fears reignited. They saw in her a potential avenue for Catholic influence. Every decision Charles made thereafter was judged in the light of Madrid. Hadn't he once risked England's future for a Catholic bride? Could he now be trusted to protect the Protestant cause? The collapse of the Spanish match also marked a turning point in England's foreign policy. For decades, James had pursued peace, hoping to balance Europe's powers through negotiation. The failure in Madrid convinced Charles and Buckingham that peace was futile. War with Spain followed, dragging England into conflicts it was ill-prepared to fight. The wars were costly and largely unsuccessful. Parliament, asked to fund them, grew resentful. Charles, impatient with Parliament's demands, dissolved it repeatedly. The cycle of mistrust deepened. Parliament accused the king of mismanagement. The king accused Parliament of sabotage. Each side looked back to the Spanish match as proof of the other's folly. For Charles himself, the memory of Madrid became personal. He had risked his pride, only to be turned away. That humiliation seems to have fueled his later rigidity. When confronted by Parliament's demands in the 1620s and 1630s, he responded not with negotiation, but with resistance. He shut down debate, imposed taxes without approval, and attempted to rule by decree. Even his relationship with his queen, Henrietta Maria, bore the marks of Madrid. Though their marriage began coldly, it grew into genuine affection. She became his confidant, his partner in politics, and his fiercest defender. But her Catholicism, always controversial, reminded Parliament of the Spanish princess who had refused him. To them, Henrietta Maria was simply another symbol of Charles's dangerous sympathies. By the 1640s, the tensions had grown unbearable. Parliament demanded greater authority. Charles refused. Religious disputes, fueled by the king's marriage and his perceived Catholic leanings, split the kingdom. When war finally broke out in 1642, it was not simply about taxation or governance. It was about trust. And that trust had been broken decades earlier in the failed negotiations with Spain. The Spanish match did not cause the English Civil War directly, but it helped shape the character of the man who led England into it. Charles's stubbornness, his pride, his refusal to yield, all were sharpened by his earlier humiliation. His enemies in Parliament, meanwhile, used the memory of Madrid as a weapon, proof that the king had once been willing to betray England's Protestant faith. When Charles was executed in 1649, the shadow of the Spanish match lingered. It was one of many missteps that had eroded confidence in the monarchy, a reminder that dynastic marriages could no longer paper over the deep divisions of religion and politics in Europe. The failure of the Spanish match also marked the beginning of the end for dynastic marriage as the central tool of diplomacy. For centuries, kings and queens had used marriage to build alliances and secure peace. But the 17th century revealed its limitations. Religion, ideology, and national identity were now too strong to be bridged by contracts alone. Spain's refusal to marry its princess to a Protestant prince showed the hardening of confessional lines. England's fury at the idea of a Catholic queen revealed the same. From then on, diplomacy would increasingly depend on treaties, trade, and war, not only on weddings. As you imagine Charles, young and awkward, standing in the glittering court of Madrid, pleading for the hand of a princess who recoiled at his touch, consider the weight of that moment. A single marriage, had it succeeded, might have bound England and Spain together, perhaps preventing decades of war, or perhaps it would have torn England apart sooner, its people unwilling to accept a Catholic queen. History does not tell us what might have been. It tells us only what was, that Charles returned home rejected, and that rejection shaped the rest of his reign. And so we are left with a haunting thought. Sometimes the most decisive events in history are not battles fought with swords, but proposals rejected with words. When you picture a royal wedding, you might think of jewels, golden carriages, and celebrations that light up an entire city. But behind the splendor of these ceremonies lay a quieter, colder truth. Marriages were transactions, and dowries were their currency. The story of royal dowries is not one of romance, but of ledgers, debts, and negotiations that could stretch for decades. In fact, many dynastic alliances that shaped the map of Europe were decided less by love or blood than by the size of a bride's dowry. In its simplest form, a dowry is the wealth a bride brings into her marriage. Among common families, this might be a chest of linens, livestock, or land. But in royal households, the stakes were infinitely higher. Dowries can include entire provinces, castles, trade privileges, fleets of ships, or vast sums of gold and silver. They were less gifts than guarantees, a way of binding two houses together with financial cement. For rulers, dowries solved several problems at once. They provided immediate wealth, secured political alliances, and signaled a family's seriousness in committing to marriage. But they also created new tensions. A promised dowry might never be paid in full. Payments might be delayed for years. In some cases, unpaid dowries sparked wars. The dowry system was, in effect, a financial battlefield. Perhaps the most famous example of dowry politics was Catherine de' Medici. When she married Henry, Duke of Orleans, later Henry II of France, in 1533, her dowry was staggering. She brought not only immense wealth from a Medici banking fortune, but also claims to lands in Italy. Yet, the payment of her dowry was so complex that disputes dragged on for decades. Catherine's marriage was initially considered a poor bargain. She was not particularly beautiful or politically powerful, but her dowry tipped the scales. Over time, she rose to become Queen of France and eventually regent. Wielding immense influence, her dowry had opened the door, but her survival skills ensured she remained in power. Catherine's case demonstrates how money could override other concerns. A wealthy dowry can make an otherwise unremarkable bride into a desirable match. Another telling example comes from Portugal. In the 16th century, Portuguese princesses were among the most sought-after brides in Europe because of the immense wealth flowing from Portugal's colonial empire. Gold and spices from Brazil, trade from Africa, and ports across Asia filled Portuguese coffers. When Catherine of Braganza married Charles II of England in 1662, her dowry included not only cash but also two enormously valuable territories, Bombay in India and Tangier in North Africa. These lands were not simply symbolic. They became crucial to England's expansion as a global trading power. In fact, Bombay would later serve as a foothold for the East India Company's domination of the subcontinent. Catherine herself struggled in England, facing infertility, political intrigue, and her husband's numerous mistresses. But her dowry shaped the future of the British Empire. Without her, England might never have gained its first major base in India. Dowries, however, were not always delivered. Spain became infamous for this. When Maria Theresa of Spain married Louis XIV of France in 1660, her dowry was set at 500,000 crowns. Spain, financially exhausted from endless wars, never paid the full amount. This failure later gave Louis XIV an excuse to press claims on Spanish territory, contributing to the outbreak of the War of Devolution in 1667. In this way, unpaid dowries became legal pretext for war. A clause in a marriage contract, a sum left unpaid, could unleash armies across Europe. For royal families, the dowry was not merely financial. It was a political weapon. The dowry system effectively turned the marriage market into a financial auction. Princes were evaluated not only on lineage, but on what their brides could bring. Lesser houses sought to elevate themselves by offering extravagant dowries, hoping to marry into more powerful dynasties. Great powers, in turn, demanded enormous sums as proof of loyalty. But this system also exposed the vulnerabilities of wealth. A bride's dowry could drain her family's treasury, weakening them for years. Conversely, a generous dowry could enrich her husband's state, fueling armies or building palaces. One striking case was the marriage of Anne Cleves to Henry VIII of England in 1540. Though Anne's dowry was not vast by continental standards, it was substantial enough to make her an attractive candidate. The marriage, however, was a personal disaster. Henry found her unattractive and quickly annulled the union. Yet even in its failure, the dowry had served its purpose, binding England and Cleves in temporary alliance against the rising power of France. For the women themselves, dowries were both empowering and imprisoning. A large dowry made a woman more desirable, increasing her chances of marrying into power. But it also reduced her to a financial transaction. She became, in effect, a vessel carrying wealth from one family to another. Queens like Catherine of Braganza or Maria Theresa of Spain were remembered as much for the lands and money they brought as for their personal qualities. Their identities were tied to what their dowries could purchase in the political marketplace. At the same time, dowries sometimes gave women leverage. A queen could remind her husband's court of the wealth she had delivered, or the territories her dowry represented. If disputes arose, her dowry became a bargaining chip. Yet this leverage was fragile, often overridden by politics or military force. Looking across Europe, it is clear that the dowry wars created winners and losers. England, through Catherine of Braganza, gained Bombay and Tangier. France, through Maria Theresa's unpaid dowry, gained justification for expansion. Portugal, by spending lavishly on dowries, tied itself to great powers but also weakened its finances. For smaller states, the pressure to provide extravagant dowries could be ruinous. The competition to offer wealthier dowries turned marriage into an arms race of money and territory. Families bankrupted themselves to secure alliances that sometimes collapsed within a generation. As you imagine the grand weddings of Europe, the processions, the jewels, the banquets, picture, too, the dusty ledgers kept by accountants, the endless negotiations between ambassadors, the unpaid sums that sat like ticking time bombs in the margins of contracts. These were the real engines of dynastic power, hidden beneath layers of silk and ceremony. So here's the question. If marriages were wars fought with ledgers instead of swords, how much of Europe's history was shaped not by love or strategy, but by unpaid bills? We have seen how dowries served as a glittering entry ticket into the royal marriage market, sometimes opening doors to empires, sometimes bankrupting families, and sometimes leaving unpaid debts that echoed for decades. Now, in this section, we turn to the ripple effects, the wars, betrayals, and shifting fortunes that unfolded when dowries went unpaid, or when their terms proved too heavy for kingdoms to bear. Perhaps no dynasty exploited dowries more skillfully than the Bourbons of France. When Louis XIV married Maria Theresa of Spain in 1660, her dowry was fixed at 500,000 crowns. On paper, this looked like a glittering sum, one that symbolized reconciliation after years of war. In reality, Spain's treasury was nearly empty. The dowry was never paid in full. Louis XIV seized upon this failure as justification for aggression. In 1667, he declared that because the dowry had not been honored, Maria Theresa's renunciation of claims to Spanish territory was invalid. By this logic, she and her descendants still had rights to parts of the Spanish Netherlands. The War of Devolution began, a conflict in which Louis's armies stormed across Flanders, all because of an unpaid marriage bill. What might seem like a minor contractual detail, the failure to transfer gold, was enough to unleash armies and redraw maps. This was the quiet, bureaucratic violence of the dowry system. For smaller kingdoms and principalities, dowries were a constant financial burden. The competition to secure good matches meant offering increasingly lavish sums. This drained treasuries and sometimes destabilized entire regimes. Consider the Italian states. The Duchy of Mantua, the Republic of Venice, and others spent fortunes marrying daughters into courts of France, Spain, or the Holy Roman Empire. These dowries often exceeded annual state revenues. Governments took out loans, raised taxes, or sold offices to meet their obligations. The people bore the cost. And when wars drained coffers, dowry promises became impossible to keep. Families begged for extensions, pleaded with ambassadors, or tried to substitute land for cash. But contracts were contracts. An unpaid dowry was not simply an embarrassment. It could invite invasion or loss of territory. Catherine of Braganza's dowry to Charles II of England in 1662 illustrates the long-term power of marriage payments. Her dowry included Tangier and Bombay, two seemingly peripheral territories at the time. Tangier proved costly to defend and was eventually abandoned, but Bombay became the cornerstone of Britain's Indian Empire. For Portugal, the gift was both a sacrifice and a gamble. By handing over such valuable territories, they bought English support in their struggle for independence from Spain. It worked. England became a crucial ally, and Portugal maintained its sovereignty. But the price was staggering. Catherine's dowry permanently altered the map of colonial empires. What began as a marriage contract reshaped global trade. Ships sailed to and from Bombay for centuries thereafter, carrying the legacy of a dowry signed in a palace far from the Indian coast. For the brides themselves, dowries could be both opportunity and curse. A large dowry made a woman more marketable, but also placed immense pressure on her. If her family failed to pay, she bore the humiliation. Husbands might mistreat wives whose dowries were delayed, regarding them as debts unpaid rather than partners in union. Maria Theresa of Spain lived this reality. Though Queen of France, she endured constant reminders that her dowry had not been delivered. The unpaid sum was used against her and against her father's legacy throughout her life. Her marriage, meant to symbolize reconciliation, instead became a daily reminder of broken promises. For other women, dowries determined their very futures. Wealthy dowries allowed princesses to marry powerful kings. Poor dowries left noble women sidelined, often forced into convents when no match could be secured. A woman's destiny was calculated not by her desires, but by the balance sheet her father could offer. Because dowries were so central, betrayals over them could be explosive. In some cases, grooms demanded repayment if marriages failed. When Henry VIII annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540, disputes arose over the financial settlement. Though the marriage had been short-lived and politically useless, the dowry negotiations had to be resolved, creating tension between England and Cleves. Even more striking were cases where dowries became bargaining chips during wars. Victorious kings sometimes forced defeated enemies to pay dowries as part of peace treaties, disguising tribute as marriage payments. This blurred the line between family alliances and outright extortion. In this way, dowries became tools not only of union but of manipulation. To marry into a wealthy house was not always a blessing. It could be a trap, binding one dynasty into endless obligations. By the 17th and 18th centuries, dowries began to include overseas possessions more frequently. As empires expanded, colonies became valuable bargaining chips. Marriages could transfer ports, islands, or trade routes. Catherine of Braganza's dowry was only the beginning. Later unions saw entire colonial economies tied to marriage. In some cases, royal brides carried rights to trade monopolies or access to lucrative resources like sugar, spices, or silver mines. Dowries thus became a hidden driver of globalization, linking the personal unions of Europe's elites to the exploitation of distant lands. Behind every colonial map of this era lies not only conquest, but also contracts signed in marriage negotiations. By the 18th century, the dowry system was straining under its own weight. States bankrupted themselves to offer dowries they could not afford. Wars erupted over unpaid sums. Women became pawns in increasingly desperate financial games. And yet, the system endured because it worked, at least in the short term. A wealthy dowry could secure a dynasty for another generation, even if it impoverished the bride's homeland. The immediate gain outweighed the long-term cost. This fragile balance could not last forever. As Europe edged toward modernity, and as ideas of national identity and personal freedom grew stronger, the idea of treating women as financial assets began to erode. By the 19th century, dowries were less central in great dynastic marriages, though echoes of the system persisted. As you imagine these stories, queens carrying the weight of unpaid dowries, kings declaring wars over missing payments, colonies handed away as gifts, picture the contract themselves. Sheets of parchment, written in cramped legal Latin, with clauses about payments, timelines, and penalties. These documents, dull to read, shape the fates of millions. And so a question lingers. How many wars, how many lives, how many empires rose or fell not because of glory on the battlefield, but because of a sum of money promised in a marriage contract and never paid? We have traced dowries from glittering promises to unpaid debts, from provincial treasuries emptied for the sake of marriage to wars declared over missing payments. Now, in this final section, we will bring the story to its end. The slow decline of the dowry system, its replacement by new forms of political and financial power, and the lessons it leaves us about the quiet economics behind history's grandest spectacles. By the 18th century, the dowry system was collapsing under its own weight. The escalating cost of marriage alliances had bankrupted smaller states and strained even the great powers. Families could no longer afford the extravagance. Inflation, wars, and colonial economies shifted the financial landscape. The very practice that had once built empires now seemed impractical. Dowries had also proven to be dangerously unreliable. Payments were delayed, reduced, or outright ignored. Ambassadors spent years chasing unpaid sums, while kings and queens used non-payment as pretext for military action. What had once seemed like a guarantee of security was increasingly revealed as a hollow promise. It was becoming clear the dowry system, for all its pomp, was unsustainable. One reason dowries declined was the rise of centralized state finances. In the medieval and early modern periods, royal households often relied on marriages to bring in cash or territory. But by the 18th century, many states had developed more sophisticated financial systems: taxation, national banks, and credit markets. This meant that rulers could fund their wars and palaces without relying on the cash or land a bride might bring. Marriage diplomacy was still important, but its financial function diminished. A dowry of a few 100,000 crowns mattered far less when a government could raise millions through taxes or loans. In short, states no longer needed brides to fund their ambitions. Another factor was cultural. Enlightenment ideas about personal freedom, individual rights, and even romantic love began to influence attitudes toward marriage. Among elites, arranged marriages remained the norm well into the 18th century, but the emphasis on massive dowries lessened. In some cases, love even began to play a role, if not in the marriages themselves, then in the stories people told about them. The age of marriage markets was slowly giving way to the age of companionate marriage, at least in rhetoric. Royalty still married strategically, but dowries became less central than dynastic prestige or political alliances. By the 19th century, particularly after the Napoleonic Wars, many dynastic marriages were arranged without large dowries at all. The practice did not vanish entirely, but it no longer carried the same weight in statecraft. The decline of dowries also shifted the position of women in dynastic politics. For centuries, a princess's worth had been measured in terms of the wealth she could carry into a marriage. With dowries less central, women were judged more on their lineage, connections, or political value. This was hardly a revolution. Women remained pawns in most royal marriages, but it did mark a subtle change. At the same time, some women leveraged the decline of dowries to assert more agency. Queens, consorts, and princesses could now argue their value came from diplomacy, influence, or motherhood rather than from the money their families provided. This shift laid faint groundwork for later arguments about women's roles in politics and society. Though the dowry system declined in Europe, its effects lingered overseas. Territories handed over as dowries continued to shape empires for centuries. Bombay, given to England with Catherine of Braganza's marriage, became a hub of the British Empire in India. Tangier, though abandoned, reflected England's first major attempt at controlling North Africa. These dowry-driven acquisitions remind us that colonial empires were not built only by conquest. They were also built by contracts, by negotiations, by the stroke of a pen in a marriage settlement. Behind the cannons and ships, there was parchment and ink. In this sense, the legacy of dowries is global. The lives of millions were shaped by agreements made in palaces thousands of miles away, in ceremonies that seemed trivial to those not privy to their consequences. By the late 19th century, dowries in royal marriages were largely ceremonial. Symbolic gifts replaced massive financial transfers. The rise of constitutional monarchies further weakened the role of royal finances in state affairs. Queens and princesses might still bring jewels, estates, or cultural prestige, but no one expected their marriages to fund armies or expand empires. In modern Europe, the dowry survives mostly as a cultural memory, sometimes as a private family custom, but no longer as a force in politics. The wars it once caused, the bankruptcies it once created, and the empires it once helped build have faded into history. And yet, the story of dowries leaves us with a haunting reminder. For centuries, the fate of kingdoms rested not only on battlefields or in council chambers, but also in account books. A promise of 500,000 crowns could mean peace or war. A delayed payment could topple alliances. A dowry chest, carried into a palace, might contain the future of an empire. It is a reminder that history is often shaped not by dramatic moments, but by quiet, bureaucratic details. Wars may be remembered, but behind them lie contracts, payments, and debts. Boring, perhaps, but decisive. So, as you picture a queen stepping into her new home, her dowry chest following behind, think not of jewels or silks, but of ledgers, of accountants, of ambassadors haggling over payments. Picture the weight of those chests not only in gold, but in expectation. Expectation that marriages could buy peace, that money could bind dynasties, that numbers could decide history. And ask yourself, how often do the most ordinary transactional details, the unpaid bill, the delayed transfer, the missing sum, become the sparks that ignite the greatest fires in history? Imagine standing in a cathedral, surrounded by courtiers, priests, and diplomats. You are dressed in silk and jewels, about to take vows that will bind you for life. But your husband is not beside you. In fact, he is hundreds of miles away, perhaps across mountains or even seas. Instead, another man stands in his place, holding your hand, speaking his words. This was a world of proxy marriages, one of the strangest and most revealing practices of dynastic politics. For centuries, royal women married men they had never seen. Their unions, sealed by ceremonies, were a stand-in. Usually a trusted noble acted on the groom's behalf. These proxy brides entered marriages that were both binding and bewildering, beginning their new lives with strangers, political obligations, and the long, dangerous journeys that followed. Proxy marriages were born out of necessity. In a time when travel was slow, dangerous, and exhausting, it was not always possible for both parties to be present for the wedding. Wars, distance, or political urgency often demanded that marriages be concluded quickly. A delay might mean the collapse of a treaty, the loss of territory, or the strengthening of a rival alliance. So the solution was paperwork and ritual. A nobleman would be chosen to stand in for the groom. He would take the vows, sometimes even slip a ring onto the bride's finger and embrace her on the groom's behalf. The marriage was considered valid from that moment, even if bride and groom had never laid eyes on each other. This meant that many queens began their married lives as legal wives before they had ever spoken to their husbands. Their fates were sealed not by personal choice, but by a ritual that blurred the line between presence and absence. For the bride, a proxy marriage was only the beginning. Once the vows were spoken, she had to leave her homeland and travel to her husband's court. This journey could take weeks or months, through hostile territories, across seas, over mountain passes. She traveled with an entourage, carrying her dowry, her trousseau, and often ambassadors who would ensure her safe delivery. The most dramatic moment of these journeys came at the border, where the bride underwent the ritual of passage. She would shed the clothes of her homeland and put on the garments of her new country, symbolizing her complete transformation. She was no longer her father's daughter. She was her husband's wife, her new country's queen. For many brides, this was a moment of profound loss. They left behind family, friends, and language, stepping into a life where everything was foreign. Their only link to home was the proxy ceremony, a reminder of vows spoken with a stranger. One of the most famous proxy brides was Marie Antoinette. In 1770, the young Austrian Archduchess was married by proxy to Louis, the future Louis XVI of France. The ceremony took place in Vienna. Her brother, Archduke Ferdinand, stood in as groom. He placed a ring on her finger and embraced her in Louis's name. Only after this ritual did Marie Antoinette set out on her journey to France, where she would meet her husband for the first time at the border. The French court staged a handover ceremony with great pomp. On an island in the Rhine River, Marie Antoinette was stripped of her Austrian clothes, dressed as a French woman, and formally handed over. From that moment, she was no longer Austrian. She was a Dauphine of France. Another striking example was Anna Cleves, who married Henry VIII of England in 1540. Their proxy wedding took place in Germany months before and set foot in England. By the time she arrived, she was already Henry's wife in the eyes of the law. Their disastrous first meeting, Henry famously complained of her appearance, was made all the more awkward because the marriage was already binding. Henry annulled it within 6 months, but the proxy vows had been real. Proxy marriages often created strange situations. Imagine a young bride, married by proxy, only to find her new husband utterly unappealing, or worse, hostile. The vows had already been taken. There was no turning back. In some cases, grooms died between the proxy ceremony and the bride's arrival. The woman suddenly found herself a widow without ever having met her husband. In other instances, political circumstances changed, alliances collapsed, treaties dissolved, leaving brides stranded in marriages that no longer served their original purpose. These awkward consequences reveal the fragility of the system. Proxy marriages were designed for efficiency, but they often collided with the unpredictable realities of human life. What made proxy marriages powerful was ritual. The ceremonies were elaborate, staged with the same grandeur as in-person weddings. Witnesses signed documents, masses were sung, rings exchanged. In some traditions, the stand-in groom even went so far as to lie beside the bride in bed, fully clothed, as a symbolic gesture of consummation. This ceremonial bedding reinforced the idea that the marriage was complete, even before the couple met. The church played a central role. Proxy marriages were recognized as valid under canon law, provided consent was given. Consent, in this case, meant signatures and words spoken through representatives. Love was irrelevant. Presence was unnecessary. What mattered was a performance of consent. For the women caught in this system, proxy marriages were both frightening and disorienting. They were bound by vows to men they had never met, obliged to leave their homes for unfamiliar lands, and expected to adapt instantly to new cultures. Their bodies and futures were treated as political tools. And yet, some women found ways to adapt. Marie Antoinette embraced her role as French Dauphine with enthusiasm, at least at first. Catherine of Aragon, who married Prince Arthur of England by proxy before traveling from Spain, eventually became Queen Consort of Henry VIII. These women turned the strangeness of proxy marriage into opportunities to carve out power for themselves. Still, the emotional cost was high. Letters from brides reveal feelings of loneliness, fear, and anxiety. They were aware that their marriages were contracts signed above their heads, their lives decided by others. Proxy marriage made that truth visible in a way few other rituals could. Proxy brides remind us of the strange lengths dynasties would go to secure alliances, to marry without meeting, to take vows through a stand-in, to transform identity at a border. These were the rituals of politics disguised as love. As you imagine a young princess in a candlelit cathedral, holding the hand of a man who is not her husband, speaking vows to someone who is not there, consider the strangeness of it, and ask yourself, in a world where presence could be replaced by ritual and identity stripped away at the border, what did marriage truly mean? In the first section, we explored the strange mechanics of proxy marriages, the rituals, the journeys, and the transformation of women into wives before they ever met their husbands. Now, we turn to the stories that reveal how fragile, awkward, and sometimes tragic these unions could be. For every queen who adapted, there were others who found themselves trapped in alliances that collapsed under the weight of politics, prejudice, or personal disappointment. No story better illustrates the perils of proxy marriage than that of Anne of Cleves. In 1540, she was married by proxy to Henry VIII of England, one of the most notorious monarchs in European history. The match was arranged as part of a Protestant alliance between England and the German Duchy of Cleves. The proxy ceremony took place in Dusseldorf, and, dressed in an elaborate German costume, was married to Henry's representative. Legally, she was Henry's wife months before she set foot in England, but when she finally arrived, the reality was very different from the contract. Henry, expecting beauty and charm, was appalled. Accounts describe him as declaring in Nothing Fair and comparing her appearance unfavorably to the portrait he had seen. The proxy vows were binding, but Henry quickly maneuvered to annul the marriage. Within 6 months, Anne was sent away. The annulment rested on technicalities, whether the marriage had been consummated, whether it had truly consented. But the fact remained, the proxy union had failed spectacularly, and, to her credit, accepted her fate with grace. She lived comfortably in England as the king's beloved sister, spared the brutal fates of some of Henry's other wives. Still, her story reveals how proxy marriages could leave women exposed, vulnerable to the whims of men they had never met. Another famous proxy bride was Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. In 1501, she was married by proxy to Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne. The match was celebrated as a union of two great dynasties, designed to cement an alliance between England and Spain. Catherine traveled to England and met Arthur for the first time only after they were already legally wed. Their marriage was short-lived. Arthur died within months, leaving Catherine a widow before her 16th birthday. Here the proxy marriage created years of political wrangling. Spain demanded the return of Catherine's dowry, while England argued that the marriage had been consummated and thus no refund was due. The dispute dragged on until Catherine was eventually married, again by proxy, to Arthur's younger brother Henry, the future Henry VIII. Her story shows how proxy marriages could entangle not just individuals, but entire nations in webs of financial and political disputes. For Catherine, the proxy vows she spoke as a teenager in Spain shaped the rest of her life, binding her to England in ways she could never escape. Marie Antoinette's proxy marriage in 1770 might have seemed symbolic, but it carried profound consequences. From the moment her brother stood in for Louis XVI at the altar in Vienna, her identity shifted. She was no longer Austrian. She was bound to France. The ritual of being stripped of her Austrian clothes at the border reinforced this transformation. Marie Antoinette herself wrote of the strangeness of the moment, describing her unease at being surrounded by strangers who now claimed her as their future queen. Her life in France would be marked by alienation, rumors, and political scapegoating. The proxy marriage had made her French before she had set foot in France, leaving her in a liminal space between two identities. In many ways, she remained a stranger both to her homeland and her adopted country. Her tragic end of the guillotine in 1793 can be traced back, in part, to that proxy wedding, a ritual that made her the symbol of an alliance but never allowed her to belong fully to either world. Proxy marriages also produced awkward situations when grooms died between the ceremony and the bride's arrival. In some cases, The bride became a widow before ever meeting her husband. In 1490, Anne of Brittany was married by proxy to Maximilian I, king of the Romans, later Holy Roman Emperor. But before the marriage could be consummated, the French King Charles VIII invaded Brittany and forced Anne to marry him instead, though legally Maximilian's wife, and was compelled to set aside the proxy union. The incident infuriated the Holy Roman Empire and sparked wars over Brittany's fate. Such cases reveal the fragile legality of proxy marriages. Were they binding if not consummated? Could they be set aside if politics demanded? These questions were debated endlessly, with answers shifting depending on who stood to gain. For the women themselves, proxy marriages could be bewildering, even devastating. Letters from proxy brides often reveal fear and uncertainty. They spoke of leaving behind their families, entering foreign lands, and pledging themselves to men they had never met. Some found ways to endure. Anne of Cleves, though rejected, lived out her life peacefully in England. Others, like Catherine of Aragon, suffered decades of struggle, clinging to vows first spoken in proxy as proof of their legitimacy. The emotional cost was rarely acknowledged by the courts that arranged these unions. To diplomats and kings, proxy marriages were efficient tools. To the women, they were life-altering commitments made in the absence of love or even knowledge of the husband. Despite their strangeness, proxy marriages were highly effective. They allowed treaties to be sealed quickly, ensured alliances without the delays of travel, and signaled commitment in a world where hesitation could be fatal. But their effectiveness was also their weakness. By prioritizing speed and symbolism over human connection, they often created unions built on fragile foundations. Misunderstandings, disappointments, and betrayals were almost inevitable. As you picture a young princess standing in a cathedral, taking vows with a man who is not her husband, think about what it meant for her. Was she truly married or only symbolically bound? Did she feel a sense of connection or only the weight of obligation? And more importantly, what happens to a marriage when its first act is absence? The absence of the husband, the absence of choice, the absence of love? We have seen the rituals of proxy marriages and the dramatic, sometimes tragic consequences they created. Now, to bring this story to its conclusion, we will follow the practice into its decline, asking why Europe eventually abandoned proxy marriages and what they reveal about the changing meaning of dynastic unions. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, proxy marriages began to fade. They never disappeared entirely, but they became far less common. Several factors explain this decline. First, travel improved. Roads, ships, and later railways made it easier for monarchs and nobles to meet in person. What once took weeks or months could now be accomplished in days. The practical need for proxy unions diminished. Second, diplomacy shifted. As states became more centralized and professional, marriage was no longer the sole or primary tool of alliance. Treaties, trade agreements, and military coalitions mattered more than symbolic unions. A king could sign a treaty without handing over his daughter. Third, cultural attitudes changed. By the late Enlightenment, the idea of marriage as a personal relationship began to gain ground, even among royals. While dynastic considerations still mattered, there was growing recognition that compatibility, or at least personal acquaintance, was valuable. The bizarre spectacle of marrying someone you had never seen began to seem outdated, even grotesque. Yet even as the practice declined, the legacy of proxy marriages endured. Women who had lived through them often carried the scars for life. Some adapted, as Anne of Cleves did, turning a failed marriage into a quiet independence. Others, like Marie Antoinette, became symbols of foreignness and isolation, shaped by rituals that stripped them of identity before they had a chance to create new ones. For queens, proxy marriages were stark reminders that their lives were never their own. Their vows were spoken in absentia, their husbands chosen in council chambers, their journeys dictated by maps and treaties. They were expected to embody alliances, even if they had never spoken to the man whose name they bore. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of proxy unions was a question of consent. In theory, both bride and groom consented to the match. In practice, the words were often spoken by representatives, and the individuals involved had little or no choice. This raises an uncomfortable truth about dynastic politics. Marriage was less about union than about obedience. The bride's consent was a formality. Her role reduced to repeating words arranged by others. Proxy marriage made this reality visible, exposing how little control royal women had over their lives. And yet, some women used these marriages to carve out influence. Catherine of Aragon invoked her proxy vows as proof of her legitimacy when Henry VIII tried to annul their union. Marie Antoinette turned her foreignness into a kind of stage presence, shaping fashion and culture in France. Even within the strangeness of proxy marriage, women found ways to assert themselves. In many ways, proxy marriages were theatrical performances. The stand-in groom, the solemn vows, the ceremonial bedding, all were symbols, rituals that made absence look like presence. They remind us that much of dynastic politics was theater. Crowds watched weddings, processions, and coronations as spectacles, often unaware of the real negotiations happening in back rooms. Proxy marriages took this theatricality to its extreme. The groom himself was not needed, only his role performed. This raises a broader question. In societies where performance was everything, how much of marriage was ever real? By the time proxy marriages faded from practice, they had already shaped centuries of history. Wars had been fought over them. Queens had been made, unmade, or humiliated by them. Territories had changed hands because of them. The lesson is sobering. Absence can be as powerful as presence. A man need not be in a room for his vows to bind a woman for life. A contract need not be signed in person to alter the fate of empires. Proxy brides show us that power often operates through symbols, through rituals that conceal as much as they reveal. As you picture those proxy ceremonies, cathedrals filled with music, brides placing rings on fingers of men who were not their husbands, entourages waiting to escort them into foreign lands. Think of what they meant. For the courts, they were efficient. For the women, they were disorienting. For history, they were decisive. So here's a final thought. In a world where presence was unnecessary, where even love could be outsourced to ritual, what was marriage really worth? Was it a sacred bond, or simply a contract written in the absence of the very people it bound? The proxy brides leave us with the unsettling reminder that history is often written in the spaces where people were not present, in the absences that shaped lives as profoundly as any presence ever could. In medieval and early modern Europe, no royal wedding was complete without approval from Rome. The Pope, sitting in the Vatican, held in his hands the power to declare a marriage valid or to forbid it outright. This authority rested in the system of dispensations, permissions granted by the papacy to bypass the rules of canon law. To understand royal marriage in this period, you must understand this quiet but decisive power, for it was a church, not kings, who ultimately set the boundaries of who could marry whom. The church's control over marriage stemmed from the laws of consanguinity, the degrees of kinship within which marriage was forbidden. In the early Middle Ages, the church prohibited marriages within 7 degrees of blood relation. This was calculated not only through direct lines, like siblings or cousins, but also through extended family ties. Under such strict rules, almost everyone in the aristocracy was technically related, making legal marriages nearly impossible. By the 12th century, the Lateran councils had reduced the forbidden range to 4 degrees, still enough to complicate most dynastic unions. For royals, whose genealogies were notoriously tangled, nearly every desirable marriage partner was too closely related. The solution was a papal dispensation. By applying to Rome, rulers could seek an exemption, allowing them to marry within otherwise forbidden bounds. These dispensations became routine, and in time, they became one of the Vatican's most potent tools of influence. To modernize, these restrictions may seem excessive. Why did the Church care so deeply about cousin marriages? The answer lies in both theology and politics. Theologically, the Church argued that close-kin marriages blurred the sacred distinctions of family, risking confusion of inheritance and morality. Spiritually, it was believed that the mixing of blood within too narrow circles invited sin. Politically, however, the rules gave the papacy leverage. By controlling dispensations, the Church inserted itself into the very heart of royal policy. Every dynastic marriage became dependent on papal approval. A pope could delay, refuse, or attach conditions to dispensations, extracting concessions of land, money, or obedience in return. Marriage was thus not only a private contract, but a form of submission to the authority of Rome. One of the most famous papal dispensations in history concerned Catherine of Aragon. As we saw earlier, Catherine was married first by proxy and then in person to Arthur, Prince of Wales. When Arthur died, she was left in limbo. To marry his younger brother Henry, the future Henry VIII, she needed a dispensation. Canon law forbade marriage between a widow and her deceased husband's brother. It was considered incestuous. But Catherine's father, Ferdinand of Aragon, and Henry's father, Henry VII, both wanted the union to proceed, so they petitioned Rome. Pope Julius II granted the dispensation in 1504, declaring the marriage permissible on the grounds that Catherine and Arthur's union had likely not been consummated. With this legal fiction, Catherine was free to marry Henry. Years later, of course, Henry VIII would use his very dispensation against her. Claiming that the marriage had been against God's law, he sought annulment, leading to England's break with Rome. What began as a papal permission ended as a schism that reshaped the religious map of Europe. Dispensations were rarely granted freely. They often came with strings attached. Monarchs were expected to make generous donations to the church, support papal policies, or offer political favors in exchange. In some cases, dispensations were delayed until rulers met papal demands. This gave the Vatican extraordinary influence. Imagine a king of France or Spain ready to seal a marriage that would bring peace or gain territory, only to be told he must first yield to Rome's conditions. The church became, in effect, the hidden partner in every dynastic union. Not surprisingly, resentment grew. Some rulers viewed papal dispensations as extortion, a way for the Pope to meddle in secular affairs. Others accepted them as a necessary evil. Either way, the Church's role was unavoidable. Refusal of a dispensation could be explosive. In 1570, Mary, Queen of Scots, sought papal approval to marry her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Though related within forbidden degrees, the marriage was permitted. It proved disastrous, ending in Darnley's murder and contributing to Mary's downfall. At other times, refusal to grant a dispensation derailed entire alliances. Marriages fell apart, treaties collapsed, and wars resumed because Rome withheld approval. Behind every dynastic plan lurked the question, would the Pope agree? The papacy's involvement in marriage also created scandals. Popes were accused of favoritism, granting dispensations to some dynasties while blocking rivals. Critics charged that Rome used theology as a mask for politics. Whether true or not, the perception fueled anti-papal sentiment across Protestant Europe. The sheer number of dispensations granted also reveals just how interrelated Europe's royal families had become. By the 16th century, nearly every royal couple needed papal approval. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and dynasties tangled themselves into knots. The irony is striking. The Church forbade close marriages, but by granting dispensations so freely, it effectively encouraged them. The result was a very genetic entanglement that produced the Habsburg jaw, infertility, and dynastic collapse. What had begun as a spiritual safeguard became, in practice, a mechanism for inbreeding. For the individuals caught in this system, the dispensation was both a lifeline and a chain. A young queen might wait anxiously for Rome's approval, knowing her entire future hinged on a parchment sealed with papal wax. A king might rage at delays, while his ambassadors negotiated frantically in the Vatican's corridors. Letters from brides to be often reveal both hope and fear. To them, the dispensation was not an abstract legal question, but the key to their lives. If granted, they would leave their homes forever. If refused, they might face disgrace or exile. The papal seal, in its quiet way, shaped destinies as surely as swords or cannons. As you picture a royal couple kneeling at the altar, consider the invisible hand behind them. Their vows were not only to each other, but also to the church that permitted them to stand there. Without a dispensation, the marriage was null. With one, it was binding for life. So here's a question. If every union depended on papal permission, was love ever truly their own? Or was it always, in the end, Rome's? We have seen how the papal dispensation worked, both as a spiritual safeguard and as a political tool. Now we turn to its most dramatic consequences. The annulments, betrayals, and conflicts that erupted when papal permissions were contested, refused, or revoked. In these moments, the authority of Rome was not just a theological matter, but a fulcrum on which kingdoms rose or fell. Few stories illustrate the contradictions of papal power more vividly than the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. As we saw in Section 1, their marriage had required a dispensation because Catherine had been married to Henry's deceased brother, Arthur. The Pope Julius II granted it, declaring that the union was valid. For nearly 2 decades, Catherine and Henry lived as King and Queen of England. Catherine bore multiple children, though only one, Mary, survived infancy. By the 1520s, Henry was desperate for a male heir. Convinced that his marriage was cursed, he turned against the very dispensation that had once legitimized it. He argued that papal permission could not undo divine law, that marrying his brother's widow was inherently sinful. Here the papal dispensation became both foundation and fault line. The marriage existed only because Rome had allowed it. Henry's demand for annulment attacked the very principle of papal authority. When Pope Clement VII refused to revoke the dispensation, Henry broke with Rome, declaring himself head of the Church of England. The result was the English Reformation. Monasteries dissolved, Catholic worship outlawed, and centuries of papal authority shattered in England. All of it, in a sense, traced back to a dispensation granted decades earlier. Henry VIII's case was the most dramatic, but not the only one. Across Europe, annulments often hinged on dispensations. If a marriage could be shown to have violated canon law, even with papal permission, rivals argued it was invalid. In 1599, Philip III of Spain nearly faced such a crisis when opponents questioned the legitimacy of his marriage to his cousin Margaret of Austria. The union had required a dispensation, and critics suggested the Pope had been pressured into granting it. Though the challenge faded, it revealed the fragility of marriages built on papal documents. Annulments also became weapons in political disputes. A king who tired his queen or who needed a new alliance could suddenly discover that their union had violated kinship rules. Whether the Pope agreed determined whether the queen was discarded or kept. Lives, reputations, and dynasties turned on the Vatican's word. Refusal to grant a dispensation could derail entire dynastic strategies. In 1570, when Mary, Queen of Scots, sought permission to marry her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, the papacy hesitated. Eventually the dispensation was granted, but the delay reflected the Church's uncertainty. The marriage, once consummated, turned toxic, culminating in Darnley's murder and Mary's downfall. Some contemporaries wondered whether Rome should have refused outright. In other cases, refusals prevented unions entirely. Princes and princesses who might have become symbols of peace instead remained unmarried, leaving treaties unfulfilled. The Church's veto power shaped not only individual fates, but the balance of Europe. By the 16th century, critics charged that dispensations were little more than a form of papal corruption. Documents were granted more readily to powerful dynasties than to weaker houses. Wealthy rulers could grease the process with donations, while lesser nobles languished in bureaucracy. Protestant reformers seized on this as evidence that Rome was more interested in money than morality. Martin Luther and his allies mocked the idea that cousin marriages could be forbidden one day and permitted the next, provided enough coin changed hands. To them, dispensations were not divine authority, but papal hypocrisy. This perception undermined the Church's moral authority. Even Catholics sometimes grumbled that theology was being bent to political convenience. The more dispensations were granted, the more hollow the rules of consanguinity appeared. Ironically, the system designed to prevent unhealthy unions ended up encouraging them. Because dispensations were granted so frequently, dynasties married within ever tighter circles. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The Habsburg dynasty epitomized this trend, producing generations of children with severe health problems, infertility, and deformities. Charles II of Spain, whose tragic reign we explored earlier, was the ultimate outcome. A man whose body bore the imprint of centuries of papal dispensations. The Church had permitted union after union, each more entangled than the last, until the dynasty collapsed under its own genetic fragility. Thus, the dispensation system did not merely affect politics. It shaped biology, carving its legacy into the very bodies of monarchs. For the women whose lives depended on these permissions, the human cost was immense. A bride might wait months or years while ambassadors negotiated with Rome. Her future was held hostage to debates over degrees of kinship calculated on parchment. Imagine being a teenage princess, told you are to marry a foreign prince, only to be kept in limbo while men argued over whether your great-great-grandmothers were too closely related. Your letters to your family would be filled with anxiety. Your trousseau packed but unused, your fate suspended until Rome decided. Such waiting could be humiliating. It sent a clear message. Your marriage, and therefore your life, was not yours to control. It belonged to men in distant chambers, to popes you would never meet. At the heart of these stories lies a fundamental question. Who has the power to define love, marriage, and legitimacy? For centuries, the answer was Rome. The Pope's signature could create or dissolve unions, legitimize heirs, or declare them bastards. Dynasties bent before this authority, sometimes willingly, sometimes bitterly. But every refusal, every delayed dispensation, every disputed annulment chipped away at that power. When Henry VIII broke from Rome, he was not only rejecting papal interference in his marriage, he was rejecting the very principle that Rome could decide such matters at all. As you picture kings and queens kneeling at altars, their hands joined, remember the invisible thread stretching all the way to Rome. Every vow was shadowed by a document, every kiss sanctioned or forbidden by a distant pope. So the question lingers. If marriage is meant to be the union of two people, what happens when it becomes instead the instrument of an institution? Can love survive when every word of consent is already dictated by the seal of Pope? We have seen how papal dispensations shaped royal marriages, enabled dynasties, and sometimes destroyed them. Now, in this final section, we follow the practice into its decline and reflect on what it tells us about the waning power of the medieval church and the transformation of marriage into something both more secular and more personal. By the 16th century, the papal monopoly over marriage began to crack. The Protestant Reformation challenged not only indulgences and church doctrine, but also the authority of Rome in personal matters. Reformers argued that marriage was a civil contract, not a sacrament controlled by the Pope. Martin Luther himself had married Katharina von Bora without papal blessing, setting an example that marriage could exist outside the church's authority. For Protestant princes, this was liberating. They no longer needed to petition Rome for dispensations. They could arrange marriages freely, without fear of papal veto. The ripple effects were enormous. Without papal oversight, Protestant dynasties were freer to pursue pragmatic or affectionate matches. Meanwhile, Catholic rulers remained bound to Rome, but even they began to chafe at its demands. The papacy's control over love was weakening. In response, the Catholic Church attempted to reassert authority. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, codified marriage as a sacrament, requiring proper witnesses and clergy. Dispensations remained necessary, but the council's reform standardized the system, making it harder to exploit. Yet the damage was done. Too many rulers had seen how dispensations could be wielded as political weapons. Too many ordinary people had grown suspicious of rules that seemed arbitrary. The very frequency of dispensations made the original prohibitions meaningless. If every royal cousin could marry with papal permission, what was the point of forbidding cousin marriages at all? The Council of Trent strengthened Catholic discipline, but it could not restore unquestioned papal supremacy. By the 17th and 18th centuries, states increasingly asserted control over marriage. Monarchs claimed the right to approve or forbid unions within their realms, bypassing Rome altogether. In Catholic countries, dispensation still existed, but kings and queens often pressured the papacy to comply with their wishes. The balance of power had shifted. In France, for example, Louis XIV insisted on controlling the marriages of his relatives and courtiers, using them as tools of statecraft. While he still sought papal dispensations for cousin unions, the decisions were often foregone conclusions, shaped more by royal will than papal hesitation. Elsewhere, particularly in Protestant lands, dispensations disappeared entirely. Marriage became a matter of state law, or even private contract. The church's grip loosened, and with it, the idea that Rome could dictate the boundaries of love. The decline of papal dispensations had far-reaching consequences. On one level, it marked the weakening of papal authority in secular politics. Where once the Pope could decide the fate of kingdoms through marriage permissions, by the 18th century his role had shrunk. Wars were now fought over trade, colonies, and ideology, not over dispensations. On another level, it reflected a shift in the very meaning of marriage. While dynastic unions remain important, the rise of Enlightenment ideals placed new emphasis on individual choice. Even royals began to speak of love as a consideration. The old world, in which marriages were dictated by Rome's parchment, was fading. For queens and princesses, this shift was double-edged. On the one hand, the decline of dispensations reduced the humiliation of waiting for Rome's approval. They were no longer pawns in endless negotiations over kinship degrees. On the other hand, they remained trapped in dynastic politics, still expected to marry for strategy rather than affection. But in the cracks of the old system, personal agency began to emerge. Some royals defied tradition to marry for love, even at the cost of scandal. Others used a loosening of papal oversight to assert their own influence in negotiations. While the change was slow, it marked the beginning of a world where marriage could be more personal, even at the highest levels. Looking back, the story of papal dispensations reveals the extraordinary reach of the medieval church. It reminds us that Rome was not only a spiritual center, but a bureaucratic power that touched the most intimate parts of life. At the same time, it shows how fragile that power was. Once rulers and people questioned it. Once the rules were seen as arbitrary, the entire edifice crumbled. The Pope's seal on a document had once determined the future of empires. By the 18th century, it was a formality often ignored. As you picture Catherine of Aragon pleading her case, Henry VIII railing against Rome, or Marie Antoinette married under rules of kinship that once required papal blessing, consider what all these stories reveal. For centuries, love and marriage were not private matters, but matters of papal jurisdiction. Kings and queens were not free in their unions. They were bound to Rome as surely as they were bound to each other. And so, the final question lingers. When an institution claims the right to control even love, how long can it hold that power before human desire, politics, and rebellion tear it away? Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were contracts, strategies, and alliances written onto human bodies. But perhaps the most unsettling element of this system was the way children, especially girls, were married off long before they were capable of understanding what those unions meant. In Europe, from the Middle Ages into the early modern period, child marriage was not only common, but expected among dynasties. To us, it seemed shocking. To them, it was practical politics. To modern eyes, childhood is a time of innocence, education, and play. In medieval and early modern Europe, royal childhood was something else entirely, a political resource. From birth, children of kings and nobles were pawns in the chess game of dynastic strategy. Their futures were mapped out before they could speak. A royal daughter might be betrothed at the age of 3 or 4. A son might be promised in marriage while still in the cradle. These early contracts were not symbolic. They were legally binding agreements, sealed with signatures, oaths, and sometimes dowry payments. The children themselves had no say. In practice, these unions often meant that a princess would be sent abroad in adolescence, sometimes as young as 12, to consummate her marriage and begin life in a foreign court. Childhood was thus abbreviated, transformed into a prelude to diplomacy. One famous example is Isabella of Portugal, daughter of King John II. She was betrothed to Prince Afonso of Portugal at the age of 5. When Afonso died in a riding accident, she was swiftly rebetrothed to Ferdinand of Aragon. That match, made while she was still a child, eventually produced one of the most famous queens of Europe, Isabella the Catholic, who would sponsor Columbus's voyages. Her story reveals how little personal agency existed. As a girl, she was shifted from one contract to another, her fate decided by negotiations between men. The idea that she might choose her partner never arose. Closer to England, we find Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII and grandmother of Henry VIII. Born in 1443, She was married at just 12 years old to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI. By 13, she gave birth to her only son, Henry, who would later become king after the Wars of the Roses. Margaret nearly died in childbirth. Her body, still that of a child, was not ready for pregnancy. She never bore another child, likely due to the trauma. Yet her survival shaped English history. Without her, there would have been no Tudor dynasty. Her story illustrates the physical dangers of child marriage. While politics demanded heirs, biology often resisted. Many young brides suffered lifelong consequences from pregnancies forced upon them before their bodies were prepared. Why was child marriage so widespread? To contemporaries, it was logical. Dynastic politics required speed. Alliances had to be secured before rivals acted. Waiting until adulthood meant risking lost opportunities. A betrothal between two children created a bond that could last decades, stabilizing treaties. There was also a theological dimension. The church permitted marriages to be contracted before puberty, though consummation was supposed to wait until both parties were of age. In practice, consummation often happened early, especially when political urgency demanded heirs. The contradiction between theory and practice left many young brides exposed to physical and emotional trauma. Anne of Brittany offers another striking case. Born in 1477, she inherited the Duchy of Brittany at age 11. Almost immediately, rival powers scrambled to marry her, seeing her hand as a key to controlling Brittany. At 12, she was married by proxy to Maximilian of Austria, but before she could join him, French forces invaded Brittany. At 14, she was forced to marry Charles VIII of France, nullify her Austrian match. When Charles died in 1498 and, still only 21, was compelled to marry his successor, Louis XII. Her childhood and adolescence were consumed by marriage politics, her body the battlefield of European rivalries. She bore multiple children, many of whom died in infancy, and died herself at just 37, worn down by repeated pregnancies. Scotland, too, saw its share of child brides. The most famous was Mary, Queen of Scots. Born in 1542, she became queen as an infant. At just 6, she was betrothed to the French Dauphin and sent to France to be raised as his future bride. She married him at 15. Her childhood was not her own. She grew up in a foreign land, trained to be Queen of France, while Scotland was ruled by regents. When her young husband died at 18, Mary returned to Scotland, a widow before her 20s. Mary's story shows how child marriage could uproot entire lives, severing queens from their homelands and making them strangers in their own kingdoms. Behind every treaty signed with a child's name lay a human cost. Young brides face the dangers of early pregnancy, isolation in foreign courts, and the psychological toll of being treated as adults while still children. Many did not survive. Mortality rates for child brides were high. Those who did often carried scars, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Letters from young queens sometimes reveal homesickness, fear, and confusion. They were children in years but adults by obligation, asked to embody alliances they could not comprehend. As you picture a girl of 12, veiled and crowned, standing in a cathedral beside a man twice her age, consider what it meant for her. To her family, she was a pawn. To her kingdom, she was an investment. To her husband, she was a vessel for heirs. So here's a question. When politics demanded that childhood be sacrificed for treaties, was there ever space left for the child herself? We have seen how childhood was shortened, even erased, for princesses whose futures were determined before they could speak. Now, we turn to the consequences of these unions. The tragedies of early death, the dynasties left vulnerable by childbearing too soon, and the psychological toll of girls made into queens before they had even grown into women. The most immediate danger of child marriage was pregnancy. Girls married in their early teens often found themselves expected to bear heirs almost immediately. Their bodies, not yet fully developed, struggled under the strain. Margaret Beaufort remains the most famous English example, giving birth at 13 and nearly losing her life. But she was not alone. Across Europe, teenage queens endured repeated pregnancies, many ending in stillbirths or infant deaths. Medical knowledge was minimal. Midwives had limited tools, and the risks of infection or hemorrhage were constant. Mortality rates were high. Young women died in childbirth at staggering rates, their bodies pushed beyond endurance by dynastic demands. Behind every royal lineage chart filled with infant deaths lies the suffering of mothers who were little more than children themselves. Child marriages often destabilized dynasties instead of securing them. Heirs born to very young mothers were more likely to be sickly or die in infancy, leaving thrones vulnerable to succession crises. Consider Isabella II of Spain, who married at 16 in the 19th century, still young by modern standards, though older than many earlier brides. Her rapid succession of pregnancies left her exhausted, and several of her children died young. Her weakened health and unstable dynasty contributed to political upheaval. Earlier, in the 15th century, and of Brittany's repeated early pregnancies produced heirs who rarely survived, leaving France scrambling for stability. Far from strengthening kingdoms, child marriages often left them precariously balanced on the health of fragile young mothers. Not every child bride grew into her role. Jeanne de Valois, daughter of King Louis XI of France, was married at 12 to her cousin Louis, Duke of Orleans, later King Louis XII. Jeanne was small, frail, and possibly deformed from birth. Her marriage was unhappy, and when Louis ascended the throne in 1498, he sought to annul the union. The church granted the annulment, citing non-consummation. Jeanne, humiliated, was cast aside after decades of service as a political pawn. She retreated to a religious life, remembered less as a queen than as an obstacle removed.